Jeremy and Claire had been dating for just over a year when they decided to take a weekend getaway to a secluded cabin in the woods. The idea was to escape the bustle of the city, unplug from their hectic lives, and reconnect with nature and each other. The cabin was charming and rustic, nestled deep within the forest, accessible only by a narrow winding trail. On their first evening, they decided to take a walk before sunset. Hand in hand, they strolled through the dense woods, marveling at the towering trees and the sounds of the forest. Birds chirped, leaves rustled in the gentle breeze, and somewhere in the distance, the soft babble of a brook could be heard. "Isn't this perfect?" Claire said, her eyes sparkling with happiness. "Absolutely," Jeremy replied, squeezing her hand. "It's like we're in our own little world." As they wandered deeper into the woods, they lost track of time. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across their path. Jeremy pulled out his phone to check the time. "It's getting late," he said. "We should probably head back before it gets too dark." Claire nodded, and they turned around, retracing their steps. The trail looked different in the dim light, and Jeremy felt a slight unease creep into his mind. He didn't want to alarm Claire, so he kept his concerns to himself. After a few minutes of walking, Jeremy thought he heard a twig snap behind them. He stopped and glanced back, peering into the gathering darkness. Nothing moved. He shook his head, chalking it up to his imagination. "What is it?" Claire asked, noticing his hesitation. "Nothing," he said with a smile. "Just thought I heard something." They continued on, but the feeling of being watched nagged at Jeremy. He couldn't shake the sense that they were not alone. Another crack of a branch sounded, this time closer. Claire heard it too and looked at Jeremy, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Jeremy nodded. "Yeah, let's keep moving." They quickened their pace, but the sounds persisted. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable, seemed to follow them. Jeremy's heart raced. He glanced around, trying to spot the source of the noise, but the thick underbrush concealed everything. "Jeremy, I'm scared," Claire said, her voice trembling. "It's going to be okay," he reassured her, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "We're almost back to the cabin." As they hurried along the path, the footsteps grew louder, closer. Jeremy's mind raced. Who could be out here? Why were they following them? "Run," he said suddenly, gripping Claire's hand tightly. They broke into a sprint, adrenaline fueling their movements. The cabin was still a ways off, but Jeremy knew they had to get there as quickly as possible. Branches whipped at their faces, roots threatened to trip them, but they didn't stop. The footsteps behind them kept pace, matching their every move. Jeremy risked a glance over his shoulder and saw a shadowy figure darting between the trees. Panic surged through him. "Faster, Claire." They burst out of the woods and onto the clearing where the cabin stood. Jeremy fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. The footsteps were right behind them. Finally, he got the door open, and they stumbled inside, slamming it shut and locking it behind them. Jeremy and Claire collapsed against the door, gasping for breath. For a moment, there was silence. Then the sound of footsteps resumed, slowly circling the cabin. "Who was out there?" Claire whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," Jeremy replied, his voice tight, "but we're safe in here." Or so he hoped. They sat in silence, listening to the eerie sounds of footsteps outside the cabin. Jeremy's mind raced with thoughts of who could be out there and why they were being followed. Claire clung to him, her fear palpable. "We need to call the police," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jeremy nodded and pulled out his phone, but there was no signal. "Damn it," he muttered. "We're too far out. No reception." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "What are we going to do?" Jeremy took a deep breath, trying to think clearly. "We need to stay calm. Let's check the windows and make sure everything is locked." They moved through the cabin, securing every window and door. The footsteps outside continued, a constant reminder that they were not alone. Jeremy grabbed a large kitchen knife, the only weapon they had. As they huddled together in the living room, the footsteps stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was even more unnerving. Jeremy's grip tightened on the knife, his knuckles white. "Maybe they left," Claire said hopefully. "I don't know," Jeremy replied, his eyes fixed on the door. "But we need to stay alert." Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Then the sound of something being dragged across the wooden porch echoed through the cabin. Jeremy's heart pounded in his chest. He motioned for Claire to stay quiet as he crept toward the front door, knife in hand. He peeked through the small window next to the door and froze. A figure stood on the porch, a hood obscuring their face. They held a large, rusted axe, which they dragged along the floorboards. Jeremy's breath caught in his throat. This was no ordinary stalker. The figure raised the axe and brought it down on the door with a thunderous crash. Claire screamed, and Jeremy stumbled back, his mind racing. They needed to get out of there. "Back door now," he shouted, grabbing Claire's hand and pulling her toward the rear exit. They bolted through the kitchen and out the back door, sprinting into the darkness of the woods. The figure's footsteps followed, relentless and unyielding. Jeremy's legs burned, but he pushed on, knowing they couldn't stop. "Where are we going?" Claire cried. "Anywhere but here," Jeremy replied, his voice strained. They ran until they reached a small clearing, gasping for breath. Jeremy scanned the area, looking for any sign of their pursuer. The woods were silent once more, but he knew better than to trust the calm. "We need to keep moving," he said. "We can't stay in one place." As they pressed on, Jeremy noticed a faint light in the distance. "Look," he pointed, "maybe it's another cabin." They made their way toward the light, hope flickering in their hearts. The light grew brighter, and soon they found themselves at the edge of another clearing. A small, dilapidated cabin stood in the center, a single lantern glowing in the window. Jeremy hesitated. "It looks abandoned, but it might be our best chance." They approached the cabin cautiously. Jeremy pushed open the door, and it creaked loudly. Inside, the air was musty, and the furniture was covered in dust. But it seemed safe, at least for the moment. "Let's barricade the door," Jeremy said. "We need to buy ourselves some time." They moved a heavy dresser in front of the door and sat down, their backs against the wall. The weight of exhaustion pressed down on them, but they couldn't afford to rest. "Who could that be?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "Why are they doing this?" Jeremy shook his head. "I don't know, but we have to stay strong. We'll get through this." Hours passed, and the night dragged on. Just when Jeremy began to think they might be safe, a familiar sound shattered the silence. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circled the cabin once more. Claire's eyes widened in terror. "They're back." Jeremy stood, clutching the knife. "Stay behind me." The door rattled as the figure tried to force it open. The dresser held, but it wouldn't last long. Jeremy knew they were running out of options. He glanced around the cabin, searching for anything that might help. In the corner, he spotted a trapdoor, partially hidden beneath a threadbare rug. "Claire, over here," he whispered, motioning for her to follow. They lifted the trapdoor and climbed down into a dark, cramped cellar. Jeremy pulled the door shut above them, praying it would conceal their presence. The cellar was cold and damp, but it was their only hope. They huddled together in the darkness, listening as the intruder finally broke through the door. Heavy footsteps echoed above them, moving through the cabin. Jeremy held his breath, every muscle tensed. The footsteps stopped directly above the trapdoor. Jeremy's heart pounded in his ears. He tightened his grip on the knife, ready to fight if necessary. But the figure didn't open the door. Instead, they stood there, silent and still. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the footsteps moved away, retreating back into the night. Jeremy and Claire remained in the cellar, too afraid to move. When the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the floorboards, Jeremy finally dared to speak. "I think they're gone." Claire nodded, tears streaming down her face. "What now?" "We go to the police," Jeremy said firmly. "We get help." They climbed out of the cellar, the cabin eerily silent. Outside, the forest was bathed in the soft light of morning. Jeremy took Claire's hand, and together, they made their way back through the woods, determined to find safety and answers. As they walked, Jeremy couldn't shake the feeling that this nightmare was far from over. But he knew one thing for certain: they would face it together. Robert had always been a skeptic, brushing off urban legends and ghost stories as nothing more than figments of overactive imaginations. However, his outlook began to change one crisp autumn evening. He had just moved into a new house, a quaint yet isolated property at the edge of town. The isolation was precisely what he wanted, a peaceful retreat from his bustling city life. It started subtly with little things. An open door here, a misplaced item there. Robert chalked it up to the chaos of moving, but as the days went by, the occurrences grew more unsettling. One evening, as he was unpacking in the dimly lit living room, he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whispering. He froze, straining to hear more, but the house fell silent again. He tried to dismiss it as his imagination, but the unease gnawed at him. The following day, he found deep scratches on the wooden floor that he was certain hadn't been there before. He had no pets, No logical explanation for the markings. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Robert installed security cameras around the house. For the first few nights, the footage showed nothing unusual. But on the fourth night, as he reviewed the recordings, his blood ran cold. The camera in the living room captured a shadowy figure moving slowly, deliberately, across the room. The figure stopped in front of the camera, its face a blur, and then vanished. Robert's rational mind fought against the evidence, but fear began to creep in. He started to notice other things: cold spots in the house, a sense of being watched, and those whispers, always just on the edge of hearing. His sleep became fitful, plagued by nightmares of shadowy figures closing in on him. One particularly bad night, he woke with a start to find his bedroom door wide open. His heart pounded as he crept through the dark house, clutching a baseball bat for protection. As he passed the living room, he felt a chill and heard the whispering again, louder this time. It seemed to be coming from the basement. Taking a deep breath, Robert descended the creaky stairs. The basement was cold and damp, filled with a musty smell of disuse. He moved the beam of his flashlight around, revealing nothing but old furniture and storage boxes. Then in the far corner he saw it, a small wooden door he hadn't noticed before. His pulse quickened as he approached the door. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack, he could see a faint light. Gathering his courage, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small and bare, except for a single flickering candle on the floor and what looked like a journal lying next to it. Robert picked up the journal, its leather cover worn and cracked. As he flipped through the pages, he realized it belonged to a previous occupant of the house. The entries were dated from decades ago, detailing a descent into madness. The writer spoke of shadows and whispers, of feeling watched and losing their grip on reality. Robert's hands trembled as he read the final entry. "They're coming for me. I can't escape them. The shadows are everywhere. If you find this, beware. Leave this place before it's too late." The candle flickered out, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through Robert as he fumbled for his flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. The whispers grew louder, surrounding him, suffocating him. He stumbled back through the door, up the stairs, and into the safety of his bedroom, where he locked the door and curled up on the bed, shaking. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside sent his heart racing. He knew he couldn't stay here, not if he wanted to keep his sanity. As dawn broke, Robert packed a bag and decided to leave, at least for a while. He needed to clear his head, to figure out what was real and what wasn't. But as he drove away, the whispers followed. Robert couldn't shake the feeling of being watched even as he drove miles away from the house. The whispers, now a constant background noise, seemed to echo in his mind, growing louder the farther he went. He decided to stay at a small motel on the outskirts of the next town, hoping a night away would help him regain some clarity. The room was simple but clean, with a single window overlooking a dimly lit parking lot. Exhausted, Robert collapsed onto the bed, but sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shadowy figure from the living room footage, its blurred face haunting his thoughts. He spent the night tossing and turning, the whispers never ceasing. By morning, Robert knew he needed help. He drove to the local library, hoping to find some information about the house's history. As he pored over old newspapers and records, a pattern began to emerge. The house had a dark past, with every occupant over the last century reporting similar experiences: unexplained noises, shadows, and eventual madness. Many had left abruptly, while others had disappeared without a trace. One name stood out: Evelyn Carter, a young woman who had lived there in the 1940s. Her diary, the one Robert had found, was mentioned in a local legend. According to the legend, Evelyn had dabbled in the occult, trying to communicate with spirits, but something had gone horribly wrong. She had become trapped in her own home, haunted by the very entities she had tried to summon. Determined to break the cycle, Robert contacted a paranormal investigator named Dr. Laura Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell had a reputation for tackling the most challenging cases and agreed to meet him at the house. They arrived at the house just as the sun began to set. The air felt heavy with anticipation as Dr. Mitchell set up her equipment: cameras, audio recorders, and EMF meters. She walked through the house, her expression growing more concerned with each room she entered. "It's strong here," she said, her voice hushed. "Whatever it is, it's tied to this place." They descended into the basement, where the small wooden door stood ominously. Dr. Mitchell opened it cautiously, revealing the room where Robert had found the journal. She placed a series of candles in a circle and began to chant softly, hoping to communicate with the spirits. The air grew colder and the whispers intensified. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of Robert's vision, but he forced himself to stay focused. Dr. Mitchell's chanting grew louder, more insistent, until suddenly the room fell silent. A figure materialized in the center of the circle, a woman, her face pale and eyes hollow. Evelyn. She stared at Robert, her expression a mix of sorrow and desperation. "Help me," she whispered, her voice the same one that had haunted him for weeks. Dr. Mitchell spoke calmly. "Evelyn, we're here to help. Tell us how we can free you." Evelyn's form flickered, and she began to speak, her voice trembling. "I was foolish. I wanted to communicate with the dead, but I opened a door I couldn't close. The shadows, they feed on fear and despair. They trapped me here, and now they're trying to do the same to you." Robert felt a surge of determination. "How do we stop them?" Evelyn pointed to the journal. "There's a ritual, a way to banish them. But it requires great strength of will. You must not give in to their whispers." Dr. Mitchell retrieved the journal and quickly found the ritual. She began to read aloud, her voice steady and strong. The shadows writhed and twisted, the room growing colder with each passing second. Robert felt a pressure building in his head, the whispers screaming now, trying to break his resolve. He focused on Evelyn, on the hope of freeing her and ending this nightmare. As Dr. Mitchell reached the final words of the ritual, the shadows erupted in a cacophony of wails, and then abruptly vanished. The room fell silent, the air warm again. Evelyn's form shimmered, a look of gratitude crossing her face. "Thank you," she whispered before fading away. Robert and Dr. Mitchell stood in the now empty room, the weight of what had happened settling over them. They left the house together, the whispers finally gone, and drove away in silence. Robert never returned to the house. He sold it, disclosing its history to the new owners who were paranormal enthusiasts, eager to study its mysteries. He hoped they would be more prepared than he was. For the first time in weeks, Robert slept peacefully, the haunting whispers no longer following him. He had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, the echoes of the past finally silenced.